It's a sentence that I don't mind saying at the start of every single video, but Manchester United are looking like a shambles at the moment, and they come up against Brighton this weekend, a team that has scored more than twice as many goals as them in the first four matches of the season. So it's not going to look very good for Erik ten Hag from the very outset, but I feel like there's a bigger lesson to be learned here. Instead of doing a straight preview between Brighton and Manchester United, I want to see what the big significant differences between the clubs are and what that really means for the two's future and the lessons that Manchester United really need to learn. So, first up, I'm going to run through the starts of the season. Manchester United are currently in 11th place with 6 points, which is admittedly a little bit kind. So, for example, the first match they won, which was against Wolves, they sort of got away with because Onana punched a Wolves player in the head and didn't concede a penalty somehow. That should, in theory, put them down to 4 points, and even then, they feel like they've gotten lucky with the other points that they've picked up. It's not been a bunch of top class performances, and that's because there are some significant problems at Manchester United. The first of these is undoubtedly, to me, the transfer policy. Everyone knows it. As of late, Manchester United invest a hell of a lot of money with the Manchester United tax being applied, but there's an argument that that applies to every single Premier League club right now. There's a reason that the average transfer cost has flown up in the Premier League, and it has huge net spends rather than net gains throughout most of the clubs at the very least. Now, in theory, this wouldn't be too bad. There's a lot of clubs that spend a lot of money on their players with 70, 80, 90 million pound transfer fees, and they don't immediately collapse. That in itself isn't an issue, but it's the way that it's applied. It's the fact that a lot of the time it feels like the manager saying, I want this player, and then this player not fitting into the system at Manchester United or not adapting properly or anything like that. In addition to that, there's clearly an internal discipline issue at Manchester United. Jadon Sancho's thing is just one example. There's a lot of other ones, but they are things that I feel uncomfortable commenting about on a legal perspective. The Jadon Anthony thing ultimately sums it up. It's a rift between the players and the management, which there's a hell of a lot of mistrust in that gap, and is something that the club really need to work on if they want to keep on growing. And I think Sancho is the perfect example of both of these things. From the personal issues point of view, we all know what's going on there. Jadon Sancho is doing things like arriving late to training and disrespecting the management, apparently, and they're making active statements against him. But also from the transfer policy point of view, he was a player that Manchester United pursued for 2 seasons doggedly, saying we desperately need this player. And he's a player that eventually didn't fit into the system, and because of how thoroughly they were pursuing him, Borussia Dortmund were able to shoot the price up to something along the lines of £73 million, and they've not gotten that value out of him. At the same time as the club are dealing with FFP issues because the Glazers won't invest, that's a completely different issue. Spending those massive fees on players that don't quite fit is not ideal. And I think that they need to do quite a lot of learning from Brighton. Brighton are one of the best run clubs in world football at the moment, and there's a few examples why. So, for example, I'm going to dive first in the transfer policy point of view, and I think Ben White is the perfect example of that. Ben White came up through their academy, got loaned out to Leeds United, who then wanted to sign him for something like £20 million, £30 million, and Brighton said no. And this isn't a question of acquiring players, this is a question of knowing the value of players. Brighton knew they had a better player than a £30 million defender on their hands, so they just waited a season and played him because they knew he was Premier League quality. There was a Premier League club that wanted to sign him, so give him a shot. After a season, they sold him to Arsenal for something like £50 million. It's smart to walk away from moves that do not work for you and understand how much your players are worth and try and get the most out of that. Another situation for that, also sort of aligning with the internal discipline thing, is Moises Caicedo. Moises Caicedo, admittedly, this January had a little bit of an internal disciplinary issue at Chelsea, where he was, not Chelsea, at Brighton, where he was trying to force a move to Chelsea. Brighton, again, with the player value thing, knew how much they wanted for him and stood by it. Chelsea weren't reaching the bids that they wanted them to. Moises Caicedo might have sat out training, but Brighton simply said, that's fine, we'll wait until February and then you can start playing again. Because what's the player going to do? Is he going to say, I'm not going to play football for the rest of the season, or I'm going on a permanent strike? Because that's not going to work. No one's going to buy a player like that. In the end, they were able to get £115 million out of him from an investment that was just £4 million. And that is another dive into why their way of dealing with internal discipline works. because they understand it's not just an issue of is the player happy at the club, it's an issue of does the finances make sense? Because you don't want to buy or sell a player if it doesn't work. Jadon Sancho, again with the player value thing, apparently Manchester United placed a £60 million price tag on him over the summer with potential Saudi Arabia bids, a player that they don't necessarily want to keep and that they could probably sell for less than that because he's not worth 63 million quid at the moment. And it just didn't work because they didn't understand the value and they thought they were special because Manchester United. And back on the recruitment side, I really think that Brighton have nailed it when it comes to investing in players from different places. Kaoru Mitoma is the perfect example in addition to Moises Caicedo. A lot of, for example, Chelsea's recruitment this season has been look at Brazil, find the wonder kids, buy the wonder kids for 20 million quid apiece. Kaoru Mitoma and Moises Caicedo were both something like £4 million, and they multiplied their investment on Caicedo by, off the top of my head, something like 28 times. Absolutely insane, combined with the way that Mitoma worked, in which they were able to basically say, no, we'll just keep you, and you are really good, and you fit into the system, so you can play for Brighton. And if any interest comes in, then they will just get as much money as they can out of the buyer, because that's how Brighton work, and it makes sense. You don't have to be attached to a player. You need to know that the player fits the system. If the player doesn't fit the system, then you either don't buy them, or if they're already here, you sell them for a decent amount of money. And then you can reinvest that, and that's something that Manchester United has missed out on. It's really bad at selling players. It's really bad at buying the right players. And when it does buy the right players, the fees are exorbitant. £90 million or something like that for Antony was absolutely bonkers because he's not done anything. Sancho hasn't done anything. And they're still missing a proper centre forward with lots of experience. They threw a lot of money at Rasmus Højlund, but he's got less than 30 senior goals. He cost something like £2 million per goal he's got in his senior career, which is not ideal. I think that Manchester United have a hell of a lot to learn from Brighton, and I'm going to get into some predictions. Short term, I'm just going to predict the match ahead of us. I genuinely think that Brighton could do a job on Manchester United. It is not looking good. The potential for Harry Maguire starting at the back when he's already insanely low on confidence, alongside Johnny Evans with a left-back crisis that could put Serge Reguilon in there, and Aaron Wan-Bissaka, who is good, but he can't make up for three other defenders effectively being missing. It just screams Mitoma and Joao Pedro and Danny Welbeck pulling them apart. In the long term, I think Brighton are going to continue on this trajectory because they are intelligent enough to understand where their wins are coming from and where they shouldn't be venturing. On the other hand, I think Manchester United, if they keep on with their current trajectory of just follow Ten Hag and trust him, there could be significant issues. Ultimately, I think Brighton are catching up to Manchester United, as weirdly as it sounds, and might eventually overtake them if, the paths don't change. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I know that Manchester United fans might not like the conclusions, but they are what they are. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe. I will see you later.